Good evening, everyone. My name is Patrice Rankin, and I'm professor of classics at the University of Chicago. I have the honor of welcoming you to the third and final of this year's Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lectures, sponsored by the Division of Humanities, which Professor Mary Beard at the University of Cambridge will deliver momentarily. The series has been titled, What Can We Learn from the Classics? If you're a classicist, you know Mary Beard's scholarship spanning almost the past 40 years. This work includes the 1998 publication, Religions of Rome, books on the Parthenon and the Colosseum, the 2007 monograph, The Roman Triumph, and more recent books that strike at the heart of who we are as individuals and as a culture, such as How Do We Look? The Body, the Divine, and the Question of Civilization, published in 2018. For those outside of the professional field of classics, let me give you a sense of Mary Beard's reach and impact. Upon her request, let me repeat that, upon her request, so that you know the kind of scholar and teacher that Mary is. This is not a requirement of the Berlin lectures. Upon her request, Mary asked to visit some classes being taught in the classics department this term. My students and I, reading Herodotus in Greek, had the privilege of having Professor Beard in class on Monday, and Professor Michelle Lowry had her in class right after my class, in fact. Mary and I walked over to Cobb Hall together and sat outside of the classroom waiting for the preceding class to exit and for my students to arrive. As we sat and chatted, and as the time came for students to end their classes and walk to their next appointments, a young woman walked up to Mary and said, "Hello, Mary Beard. I just wanted you to know how much I enjoyed your documentary on Pompeii." Mary, of course, engaged this young student generously and attentively. Last night, you heard a similar story from Professor Ando, multiplied by several women in Italy studying Roman history, looking to Mary Beard for guidance. I must note that our student in Cobb Hall, from what I understand from Mary, is not studying classics, and yet she knew and recognized Mary Beard. So many up-and-coming professors boast of being or desiring to be public intellectuals. Social media like Twitter and Instagram augment our reach outside of these hallowed halls of academia. But we all can take a lesson from Mary Beard on being public scholars, who somehow reach young people and spark their interests through our ideas and allow them to develop their own thoughts and find their own way. And what would those thoughts and ideas be? If you had the microphone, what might you say? How might you influence your listeners? Professor Beard has answered the questions of the what and the so what masterfully in her past two lectures, offering us a master class both on classics and on purposeful living, thinking, and communicating. In her first lecture titled A Piece of Cake, Professor Beard gave us the unforgettable image of little Mary at 5 years old visiting the British Museum and being in awe of a fossilized piece of bread from Egypt of the second millennium BCE. A curator let little Mary hold this bread, which only enhanced her marvel. Professor Beard centers the experience on the Greek word thauma to convey her sense of awe and wonder at this artifact, arguing that thauma, awe or wonder, is itself one of the things we can learn from classics. She closed this first lecture with the cartoon of H.M. Bateman, the 20th century British humorist known for his series of cartoons, The Man Who, ... In contrast to little Mary holding her Egyptian bread, thanks to the curator who opened the glass, in Bateman's cartoon, we see the boy who breathed on the glass. This boy is arrested by guards at the museum and spends his life in prison, not marveling nor able to spark wonder in anyone. I was struck by this image of the boy who breathes on glass, in part because we have a parallel a little closer to home from the Pulitzer Prize-winning Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks' Boy Breaking Glass, which is from the collection In the Mecca. Brooks published In the Mecca in 1968 as a meditation on the people living in the Bronzeville apartments built in 1891 for the World Fair and later inhabited by marginalized Black residents. While Bateman's boy merely breathes on glass, Brooks' boy breaks glass as what he calls a cry of art. He says, "I shall create, if not a note, a whole." As much as contemporary classicists argue about what the classics should be and what kinds of people should be admitted to its study, Professor Beard conveys the simple truth that a word, idea, or relationship can change a life, and perhaps even prevent the shattered pieces of broken glass. The boy in Brooks's poem, whose name we threw away, could have been Mary Beard. I bring up these images of wayward boys and add to them the villain Killmonger from Black Panther, perhaps in addition, so maybe the students know that reference, who also relates to artifacts from the past in a key museum scene early in the movie, in this case, Bobo Ashanti and Edo relics from present-day Ghana and Berlin, which ground the film's fictive world in a greater set of complexities and contradictions. As we consider these silly boys, as Homer might put it, we also ask the question of what past, whose past, and whose artifacts. Professor Beard has shown us that she is not shy about these complexities. In that first lecture, she paints a picture of herself sitting at the kitchen table reading her Greek and Latin, the exact same place where I studied my Greek and Latin. Perhaps many of you also studied your lessons there. In her case, with a poster of Angela Davis hanging above. These are perhaps contradictory impressions to our mind, but Mary models the examined life and encourages us that living with contradiction is quite a good idea. She is a complex and agile thinker. From the classics, Professor Beard argues or proffers that we, at least for the moment, believe we see ourselves in the mirror, but she also warns us of what she calls, in an astonishing phrase, the fragility of the enticing familiarity, the fragility of the enticing familiarity. What we learn from classics is, in part, the fragility of heritage, lineage, or legacy. Every seemingly familiar phrase, artifact, or personality from the past turns out to be strange, different, and perhaps unfamiliar. Clearly, the we that Mary names, to which I also have been referring, is fragile, tenuous, and in need of constant renewal and redefinition. The present is under construction, as it were, and for this reason, too, we turn to the past. We are all very much looking forward to this third Berlin Family Lecture titled Fear and Loathing, in which Professor Beard promises to take us through some of the darker developments of classics, as she puts it, its conscription to the causes of fascism, dictatorship, and far-right politics. I am certain that in her customary fashion, she will leave us with as much hope and food for thought as fear and loathing. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Beard.
Thank you very much, Patrice. I'm hugely flattered. Before I start, because I haven't done this before, I do want to pay tribute to the columns. In case anybody thinks I haven't noticed them, I think they're absolutely wonderful, and if they'd go in hand luggage, I would be taking them back with me. But I think they're safe here, okay? Okay. This lecture starts in May 1938, when Hitler and his entourage visited Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. As is well known, Mussolini was one of those dictators who invested heavily in the classical past, explicitly creating his own image in the likeness of the rulers of ancient Rome, while excavating and recreating the monuments of the city, especially the monuments of the first emperor, Augustus. He reassembled Augustus's Altar of Peace in its own new pavilion, and just nearby, to celebrate the 2000th anniversary of the emperor's birth, he liberated Augustus's mausoleum from the more recent buildings that had obscured it. Only part of the point of Hitler's visit was for Mussolini to show all this off, and several days of sightseeing were included in the trip. The role of tour guide was given to, or probably demanded of, the young classical archaeologist Ranuccio Bianchi Bandinelli, who at the time was teaching in Pisa and living in Florence on the fringes, and I really mean the very fringes, of left-wing politics and activism. He went on after World War II to become the leading archaeologist in Italy, an extremely influential teacher of the next generation of Marxizing Italian archaeologists. Why he was plucked out for the task of Hitler's guide in 1938 is not 100% clear, but the main reason is most likely that he knew about the antiquities and, crucially, he could speak fluent German. Now, Bianchi Bandinelli himself kept a diary of these few days with Hitler and later published a version of it, which has sadly never been translated into English. It's a mixture of all kinds of different registers. There's plenty of soul-searching and self-accusation. Why did he do it? Why did he agree to do this? Should he have tried to wriggle out of it? Or would that have made no difference? Should he have tried to use the opportunity to kill both of them? He had their itinerary, he was right up close. He could have taken out Hitler and Mussolini at a stroke. But what would have happened to his family, he says, if he'd done that? And it might even then not actually have altered the course of history. Yes, he insists, he was an anti-fascist, but, and here speaks the academic, a theoretical anti-fascist. But there's also some dark humour in this diary. Classicists will be amused to know that he gives the pair, Mussolini and Hitler, nicknames: Marius for Mussolini and Sulla for Hitler, right? For those that don't know those characters, they're two of the most bloodthirsty, nasty pieces of work of the late 2nd and early 1st century BC. There are also some ironic glimpses of what he terms the terrible disorganisation of the Italian fascists, from the awful lumpy German with awful howlers in it in the official programme for the events, which he found himself correcting, to the last-minute dash to kit him out in the military uniform you see him wearing in the photo, because everybody assumed he'd already got a military uniform, but he didn't have one. And throughout his account, he lets us eavesdrop on the conversations within this group. There's quite a lot of talk on classical art. When they're going round one museum, Hitler gives an awful tirade against an innocent early Christian sarcophagus, which he said he would have banned as forbidden art if it had been in Germany. For the Christians, he said the early Christians were the first Bolsheviks. On another occasion, Bianchi Bandinelli has to mediate between Mussolini, who claimed that ancient architects were all anonymous, and Hitler, who knew better, citing Vitruvius amongst others. And this is all against a background of the kind of domestic banalities that always make autocracy seem even more chilling. Every now and then, the conversation just seems so ordinary, but of course it isn't. The one I remember in particular is the page-long description of Goebbels teasing Goering, and they were both on the trip, about Goering's passion for marron glacé, candied chestnuts. And it all looks so sort of trivial and domestic, and then you think, this is Goebbels and Goering, you know? It is an extraordinary read. For those reasons, it's quite discomforting. It's a winning account, but also an uncomfortable mix of confessional, of sharp observation about what's going on, flashes of humour, and excuses for himself. Right? And I'll be coming back to it towards the end. What I'm focusing on this evening is morality and moral judgments, both in relation to the modern and to the ancient world. What do we do about, how do we object to or accommodate those who even now appropriate and weaponize the classical past for, let's say, far-right politics? But for most of the time, I'm going to be thinking about the cruelty, the violence, and the sheer nastiness of the ancient world itself. In my first lecture, I squirmed a bit about my reluctance to admire the achievements of the Greeks and Romans. But I'm turning that on its head this afternoon to ask perhaps a more obvious question, which is, how do we approach the truly dreadful sides of antiquity? I'll be putting into the spotlight, in particular, the gladiatorial games, and that's what they're traditionally called, translating the Latin word ludi, but it makes them look a bit kind of cozy, I think, games. I'll be looking at the gladiatorial games and the mass slaughter of human beings and animals, apparently for the pleasure of the audience that those games involved. This will take me back from a slightly different perspective to some of the themes I touched on earlier, because I'm interested not only in what kind of judgment we should make on that cruelty, and I guess the answer is a pretty obvious one, an unfavourable judgment, but also, again, how we start to begin to understand it. How far can we ever bridge the gap between us and the men and women, some women, sitting and watching other human beings being literally pulled apart, bleeding and dying in front of them? And my other question is, are we quite as clean in this respect as we might like to think? Okay, first, the modern world. On the screen, as appeared very briefly last time, is a couple of examples of how the ancient world has been adopted for causes that are, in some cases, about as vile as Mussolini's. Using here the marble whiteness of classical and classicizing sculpture as an underpinning of white supremacy, and I've added, for good measure, the Roman Praetorian Guard being used as the logo of a far-right militia. One question is, how do classicists, people who are professionally engaged in the study of antiquity, how do we respond to this kind of thing? In practice, what we do is deplore it amongst ourselves or on dedicated specialist classical websites, and that makes us feel quite a lot better, but it doesn't change a thing. I suspect that if the people behind these unsavoury posters actually knew how many student dissertations had been written on the use and abuse of classical imagery, even just counting the ones I know in Cambridge, by people like them, or how many papers on them had been given at classical conferences, they would, I'm afraid, feel very flattered. But I'm sure they don't know any of that. I don't think they know that they're part of our terrain. And so on it goes. So what do we do? Now, in a roundabout way, the example of Mussolini is, I think, instructive here. We've just seen Bianchi Bandinelli deploring the fascist classical project, but not actually doing anything to counter it or even to absent himself, partly on the grounds that he would have made no difference whatsoever. And in a way, you can see the point. It probably would have made no difference. After all, what was shown off to Hitler still determines, in large part, how we now see ancient Rome. Over almost a century, long after Mussolini's overthrow, his vision of Rome still remains and has proved basically ineradicable. It is his archaeologist's version of the Altar of Peace that we still visit on the left, even if it now has a brand new pavilion, but it's in the same place, the same layout. And on the right, it's his version of the mausoleum of the Emperor Augustus that has just been restored again along his lines. Now, you can chip away at this kind of appropriation, but you can't easily get rid of it once it's fixed in place. I'm going to give you one nice but ultimately rather sad example of how you might chip away at this. And that example is found in the Latin inscription, which I've pointed out with a blue arrow here. That was a major triumph of Beard and PowerPoint, I tell you. Now I've discovered how to do that. I'm unstoppable, right? Shall never have a pointer again. In a Latin inscription that was put up in the piazza that Mussolini had constructed around his restored mausoleum to celebrate his work. The text is here, don't need to go through it. It's basically saying that Mussolini had brought back greatness into the ancient city and had enhanced the modern city. But it's his name that I put a bit larger and in bold that I want you to concentrate on. Because this is what happened to it after Mussolini's fall. Now, it's a bit difficult to make out in these old photographs, but I hope that you can see that the Lini in Mussolini wasn't actually chipped away, but it was plastered over to leave just Musso. Musso in Italian is slang for an ass, the animal sort of ass. And it was happening soon after Mussolini's fall, a nice little mini subversion of the fascist order in the place where Mussolini's most dramatic classical interventions were made. Sadly, it didn't last all that long. The plaster concealing Lini began to fall off. And here he is, back again, and all fully, carefully restored in 2001, right? So Mussolini has been reinserted into his piazza within the last couple of decades. Now, there are obviously big questions there that I'm not going to stop on, but which are relevant to us in all kinds of ways about the eradication of the past and the memorials and the names of the past. But that kind of issue is one that we face too. I was very surprised to discover that it was in 2001 that it was fully restored. Now, of course, the new far-right groups that I was trailing don't have the state apparatus to write themselves and their appropriations into history in the same way. In the end, you can just burn their placards. But it's still hard to think what kind of intervention is appropriate here, and what a legitimate response to all this would be. I rather worry that the desire among some professional classicists to find a way to put a stop to this, they shouldn't be doing this is not right, is an odd way actually reintroducing gatekeeping by the back door. If we insist that antiquity isn't owned by anybody, then it's not up to us as professional classicists to act as the policeman and say what anyone can or cannot do with the Greeks and Romans. It's open to everybody, actually, to do what they want, even if we deplore it. All we can try in the face of this, I think, is persuasion. Not, I must confess, that I've had much success taking the persuasion route in this area. A few years ago now, I politely intervened when this cartoon, made by the BBC to introduce Roman Britain to middle school kids, was attacked by a far-right journalist. It had actually been going quite a while after it. It had been going quite a while, and it had appeared long before, but he only caught up with it later. This, he said, rightly, was meant to be a high-ranking Roman official and his family in Roman Britain. How on earth could they not be white? This was, you can imagine how it went, this was wokery gone mad, etc., etc. Now, in response to this, I politely pointed out on social media that what we would call, they wouldn't have, what we might call a person of colour, could have been in this position. That the Roman elite were actually much more diverse than we have often chosen to imagine. And I even identified a Roman governor of Britain who'd come from Algeria as a possible candidate for the man in the picture. Meanwhile, I considerately linked it to the website of my department, which had kindly put online some scientific papers on skeletal remains from Roman Britain showing clear evidence of ethnic diversity. What's not to like? A completely exemplary case of a calm communication of the facts to people who'd got it wrong. Persuasion, I thought, at its best. So what happened? Well, in short, the biggest social media pile-in that I've ever had in my life, and I've had quite a few big ones, with, at the very mildest end of the spectrum, those that can actually be shown, stuff like this. These guys who were doing this must have spent ages in their attics at night doing Photoshop, I think it was. Because there was a whole series of these, you know, Mary Beard's King Henry VIII, etc., etc. Now, it's hard, I suppose, now to tell what effect my intervention really had, whether anybody's mind got changed. It might have had an impact, I think, on the big silent majority on social media, who we often forget, those people who read but don't intervene. But as far as the protagonists were concerned, none of them appeared to budge a bit. Even the desperate line that I only use very rarely, which is words to the effect of, you know, excuse me, who's the professor of ancient history around this debate, had zero effect. Now, I really don't know what you do. I suppose you keep on trying to communicate, you kind of try to keep the cases open, perhaps you use, as here, a bit of satire, the kind of equivalent of the Musso joke on the left. Or maybe you just wait until the rhetoric and the pseudo-parallels simply implode, as they did with Steve Bannon's extreme right political training school, his so-called Gladiator Academy, which collapsed almost as soon as it had been launched. And these are some newspaper headlines and a picture of the Bannon Monastery at the bottom, which is once again open to the public, you'll be pleased to know. But those Bannon gladiators give me a neat segue to the central part of the lecture tonight, which turns to the nasty side of the ancient world itself and how we engage with that ethically. Now, this, of course, is a perennial dilemma in any history writing. It's the old presentist problem. How do you understand the past in its own terms, while at the same time not losing sight of your own moral compass and your obligation, I think, to evaluate the past as well as to describe it? I mean, it's another case of the stereoscopic vision. How can you speak as you, but also try to wonder what their view was? Now, I've been struggling with this quite a lot recently in writing a history of the role of the Roman emperor, treading a really awkward tightrope, actually, between, on the one hand, giving these frightful rulers a sort of free pardon simply because they lived so long ago and so cannot be judged on our terms, and on the other, finding them guilty of the crime of simply not being like us, simply being in the past. Now, that happens, I think, to anybody writing history. I think it comes in a more extreme form when it's very long ago sort of history. And I think it's almost impossible to know when you get it right. You know that you do get constantly criticised, again, on social media, for bringing in your own moral views. You should just be telling the past straight. And you say, really? Do we really want to have no judgment about these people? And it's very, very hard. But in this context, rather less difficult, I think, than emperors, is the case of the gladiatorial games at Rome. I think that can be a helpful moral magnifying lens. And it's through that lens I'm going to be thinking a bit about our morality as engaged with this, as well as those of the Romans. Because after all, despite our modern disapproval at one level, we too are still invested in the culture of gladiators and in a version of the glamour of gladiators. I think somewhere deep down, there's a bit of Steve Bannon in most of us, I'm afraid. And I'm also going to be facing the big question that historians far too often just try to shelve, which is, how on earth could they have done this? Now, that sounds like a very naive question, but it's the question that the more I think about, the more I want to know. How could these people have sat there looking at that deathly sport? How could they have? So at the back of my mind today, there's always going to be the ordinary bloke dressed up in his best toga, as you had to be in the Colosseum, sitting somewhere in the middle of the ordinary seats, watching the awful slaughter in the arena beneath him. Can we ever get anywhere near to what he thinks he's doing? And how can we do that? Now, I should make a confession at this point. About 20 years ago, Patrice nicely mentioned it, I wrote a book with Keith Hopkins about the Colosseum. And what happened there, I still think it's got some quite good points to make, but it contained most, if not all, of the blind spots that I am about to expose. So in part, what I'm going to say is a way of putting right what I got wrong 20 years ago, or what I didn't see how I could handle then. It was, in fact, roughly at the time that book was published, that I had the encounter, a bit belatedly, that kick-started some of the reflections I'm going to share with you now. I was in Rome, in the Colosseum, for a day doing some other work. But I had a couple of hours to dawdle with nothing much to do. So I ended up spending the time surreptitiously eavesdropping. You might have got the impression I do this quite a lot on ancient site. I do. It's absolutely revelatory. I was eavesdropping on the high school parties from different countries that were being shown around the building, either by their own teacher or by a tour guide, because I was curious to know what they were being told when they went to the Colosseum. I soon discovered that whatever nationality they were, one part of the script in every tour was almost identical. The teacher or the guide would say, "What used to happen here?" And almost immediately, some kid, usually a boy, stuck up their hand and said, "It's where the Romans used to kill people for entertainment and throw them to the wild beasts." Right? The teacher would then say, "Would we do that now?" And the answer was, of course, a loud chorus from the whole class of, "No, miss, we wouldn't do that now." And a kind of self-satisfied glow of kind of confidence in human progress, a sort of sanctimonious fog of self-righteousness descended on a whole lot of them, and on they went. Now, if I saw that happening today, I'd be very tempted to interrupt and go over and say, "Hang on, is there nowhere we see violence for entertainment in our own cultures? And anyway, who's still getting a thrill out of gladiatorial combat? Why have you come here, right? And which of you has just bought a souvenir gladiator model? Or had their picture taken for a rip-off price with one of the scam gladiators outside?" I think the scam gladiators have now been banned, but 20 years ago, they were big business and a permanent fixture at the Colosseum. And you can see some of them. And I'd have said, who's queued up to see the movie Gladiator, which was then recently out? Now, it would have been a bit rude and a bit unfair, because in a way, the young people's answer was sort of right. But what bothered me was they never seemed to get beyond that apparently unreflective sense of moral superiority. So there are several issues intertwined here, from the historian's dilemma about how to understand, through our sense of moral revulsion, which I hope we haven't lost, to the continuing popularity, or at least high profile or even glamour, of the gladiatorial games in our cultural imagination. Now, let me take a step back for a few minutes and just look very quickly at what we know or don't know about these shows before I move on to my more particular questions. Because in a way, most of us know quite a lot. Gladiatorial games are one thing, I think, in Roman culture that most people have some kind of picture of, like the students in the Colosseum, and most of us could give a very rough description, if challenged, I think, of what went on in them. We talk about the gladiators, who were usually slaves, captives, think Spartacus, or condemned criminals, plus a few desperate volunteers, and they were pitted in fights against each other that sometimes went to the death. So we talk about them, we'd say something about the other fighters and the other condemned criminals, most famously, but not only, the Christians, being effectively executed by wild beasts in full public view, thrown to the lions, as the familiar phrase goes. It's also, I suppose, quite common knowledge that gladiatorial combat like this was a kind of USP of Romanness. And I've been talking about the Colosseum only so far, the vast amphitheatre in the centre of the city of Rome. But an amphitheatre on a smaller scale, built primarily for gladiatorial shows, is one of the things you'd expect in almost any reasonably sized, smallish Roman town, whether that's Pompeii on the left or the amphitheatre in Roman London on the right. You'll see that the amphitheatre in Roman London needs a lot of lights to help it look like an amphitheatre, but it's broadly correct. It can sometimes look like this fashion, these games, didn't actually spread very much to the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Greek part. But that's only because in the East, they didn't usually build new amphitheatres with the seats going all the way round, which is what amphitheatre means. They tended to convert their slightly differently designed theatres, sort of U-shape, or even their racetracks to host gladiators and beasts. You needed barriers to keep the animals off the spectators, but that was all. And you can still often, if you look when you're going around theatres in Greece and particularly Turkey, you can see the fixings where those barriers were actually put in place. So the fact that you haven't got amphitheatres in the Greek world doesn't mean the Greeks were nicer, even though that is a common misapprehension, right? They were just as keen on gladiators as anybody. And all over the Roman world, gladiators featured in mosaic pavements, like you see here. On the right, I think, I'll come back to this very briefly, one of the most kitsch the representations of gladiators that you can possibly imagine. You know, little cupids on a floor in a villa in Roman Britain pretending to be gladiators, right? And they occur in trinkets and in graffiti, you name it. The basic rule is that Romans and murderous games went together. And that, I think, is that's common knowledge for very many people. I've added a little bit in, but none of that's surprising, I think. If you dig a bit deeper than what I've just said, it actually seems all a bit worse and a bit weirder than the common knowledge suggests. There is some evidence for slaughter on a really massive scale. One Roman writer records, for example, that in the vast games held by the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, 10,000 gladiators fought over several weeks and 11,000 animals were killed. Now, that may be an exaggeration and it's not clear who did the counting, but even if you halve it, it's still pretty terrifying. And the methods of killing human victims could be ingeniously horrid. Condemned criminals were put to death in the arena in quite exquisitely awful ways. In a book of poetry written to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum in 80 CE, the poet Martial describes how some executions of condemned criminals were staged to mimic the deaths or torments of mythical characters. One man, for example, was made to play the part of Prometheus, who in the myth was chained to a rock and had his liver torn out by an eagle. The same happened, it was said, in the Colosseum, though a Scottish bear was substituted for the bird. Right? Whether that makes it better or worse, I have no clue. Right? There are, of course, many puzzles too. We don't know how this gladiator culture started. Romans often speculated that it came from their northern neighbours, the Etruscans, but that was a claim they often made when they didn't know what the origin of something in their culture was. Nor do we know how and why it ended. That's almost certainly connected somehow with the growth of Christianity, but exactly how is not so clear. There's no sign of any outright blanket Christian ban. I don't think here we need to think of the first Christians as humanitarians. Perhaps more surprising is we don't really have any overview of what a whole day's performance at these games would be like. We have plenty of snapshots, like this graffito, which I've now displayed on its own because it's worth looking at it again. This apparently records gladiators, probably real gladiator fights, commemorated on a wall in the city of Pompeii. It's not wholly easy to decode it in detail, but it shows certainly one pair of gladiators there fighting each other, and the other people appear to be musicians. So they are fighting, apparently, with a rather raucous musical background. And their names, and the Latin isn't, again, terribly easy to decode, their names and their past form, a bit like a racehorse, are scrawled next to them. The V's and M's that you see as letters occurring in the writing stand for vicit, he won, and missus, he was reprieved. That is, he lost, but he wasn't killed. But we have no idea, really, or not much of an idea, of how any of this fitted together, what a day at the Games would be like. We haven't got a programme. Modern accounts say things like the shows usually started around 10 o'clock with fights between gladiators, and the bloodiest spectacles involving condemned criminals took place over lunchtime, etc. Those are, let me warn you, somewhere on the spectrum between sheer fantasy and willful overgeneralization. Equally mysterious is how on earth they acquired the animals for the really lavish shows. In the 19th century, it took the British a whole squadron of soldiers, a 2,000-litre water tank, an enormous time and trouble to get this poor hippopotamus to London. How on earth the Emperor Commodus acquired 5 of them, plus 2 elephants, a rhino and a giraffe at the end of the 2nd century is, I think, anybody's guess. Those puzzles apart, though, the reason why most of us are familiar with the Games is because for several modern centuries in the West, they've also, as I said, taken a prominent cultural place in our culture in inverted commas. Whether that's in paintings like this by Jerome, which is said to have inspired Ridley Scott's recreation in the Gladiator movie, to Simeon Solomon's focus on the women, a rather nasty picture of the women in the audience. Here, one's got her thumb down as if to demand the death of a defeated fighter. Or in more modernist style, De Chirico's gladiators practicing, and there are loads of many more popular versions too. I mean, my childhood favourite was always Asterix the Gladiator, all right? Here, seen in a wonderfully, wonderfully anachronistic setting, because we're clearly in the Colosseum, but it hadn't actually been built by the time of Julius Caesar, which is when the story is set. And in one of the other myths of gladiator culture, which is quite wrong, they're saying the famous phrase, "Hail Caesar, those about to die salute you." So far as we know, that was never used in the amphitheatre. We have one reference to that when Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, is staging another dastardly naval battle, but not in the amphitheatre. And there's plenty of gladiator jokes. This is one of my favourites, but cheesy. He says, "I'm a gladiator, but that's just to put food on the table. What I really want to do is teach." Right? Now, I suppose what drives this cultural strand is a strange mixture of prurience, the pleasures of revulsion, while also being able to enjoy it from a safe position of moral superiority, or in the case of the cartoons, of familiar domestication. And I suppose that it's something like that that must account for the enormous numbers of visitors to the Colosseum itself. The brutal truth about the remains of it now is that the exterior is unforgettable. The interior is a waste of time, right? If there are any people here going to Rome and they haven't visited the Colosseum and they're thinking about it, don't bother, right? Just look at the outside. There's plenty more interesting things to see. All the seats have gone, apart from some unimpressive reconstructions. There's no floor. You can't see what happened where. And although it was once marble-faced, it's now just a load of bare brick wall. However, with over 7 million visitors a year, it is the most visited site in Italy. It tops the Vatican, and it is roughly 3 times the footfall of Pompeii. Right? It is Italy's biggie. And it's one of the most visited tourist attractions in the world. It's beaten by the Louvre, it's beaten by the Great Wall of China, but it's up there in the top 5 or 10. Why on earth is it? Well, I suppose you might say that most visitors, before they visited, don't know that it's a waste of time. So they pay up expecting it's going to be good, and then you see them wandering around thinking, what do we do? And go out. And the kids certainly don't think much of it, which is why the teachers have to be damn hands-on, to explain all this. There are a few others, I think, for whom it is still a site of Christian pilgrimage in reflection of the Christians killed in the Colosseum. But I don't think that's very many. There's still a cross there, and the Pope still goes there at Easter to commemorate that. But I don't think it's the big driver of tourism. And I have to suspect that there's something here of a sort of dark tourism and the kind of vicarious thrill of violence that you get. But even so, it doesn't act that out very well for you. And for those of you who heard my first lecture, and I suppose I'd say, if there's a stepping stone side to this, I don't know whose feet we're treading in, actually. And you don't see, interestingly, if you can tell that, more snooping, you don't see good photo ops in the Colosseum. There isn't a good place where people are getting photographed, because there isn't really anything to see, right? Now, I think that we all, absolutely all of us, ought to ask ourselves much more insistently than we ever do, why we are all, and to some extent no one's off the hook here, why we're all so intrigued by gladiators. But that is only part of the way that I want to go, because there's the further question, against that background, of how historians decide to write about this phenomenon. How do we package it? Well, I'll tell you what the standard tactic is, because I've done it and I'm as guilty as this as anybody. The standard tactic is to start your discussion of the Colosseum with a few sentences saying how ghastly it all was and almost past our comprehension, and then that done, to proceed to find ways of evading the issue and avoiding the horror and not mentioning it or trying to find it a bit more manageable. You kind of park the nasty bit and say it's awful, and we really, moderns will just not be able to imagine what it could possibly be like, and then off you go as if nothing had happened. If classicists in the audience want to know which books I think avoid doing that more than most, I think the old book by Carlin Barton probably does, and also Garrett Fagan, but they still don't go quite the direction that I'd like them to go. Okay, so what are the ways of evading this issue? Once you've said this was all absolutely terrible, and we can't possibly imagine, it's unimaginable in Louis MacNeice's words. Well, what are the ways of evading the issue? Well, one way is to say, and I've done this, that leaving aside one or two grand headline spectaculars in the Colosseum presented by emperors, where there really was a lot of blood spilt and no expenses spared on the animals, most shows across the Roman world in places like London were much lower key. The animals would be what you could round up in the countryside nearby, and they'd be more wild boars than wild elephants. And the death rate among gladiators was much lower than we might fear. Now, this is a bigger section here of the wall on which the gladiator graffiti from Pompeii was found. If you look down the right-hand side, where there's all the losing characters on the right-hand side, you'll see an M next to every single one of these. In each case, that's to say, the loser, was down and out. He could have been killed, but he wasn't. Right? He was reprieved. And those reprieves, though we can't calculate it exactly, look as if they were very common, even if not the norm. So why? Well, more than anything else, it's grim economic reasons. In Roman terms, gladiators are expensive commodities, expensive to buy in the first place if they were enslaved, and to feed and train, whether they were enslaved or free volunteers or even criminals. You actually can't afford to kill too many. And pushing that a little further, as I have been tempted to do, it has even been suggested that a lot of the time, not necessarily in the Colosseum, but in the I can't do American football leagues, but I would say, at the top, not in the Premiership, but in the Championship, I would say, in the UK. If you go down a grade, it might have been that all this fighting was a bit closer to professional wrestling than it was to boxing. That is, it was more of a parade of sham fighting and an awful lot of grunting than the sharp edge of the sword. Right? That's one way. It's not all like that. And I think up to a point, that's true. Another common way round the problem, and I'm going to plead guilty to this one as well, is to try to look past or through the murderousness of it all, to concentrate instead on the second-order functions of these gladiatorial occasions. The audience at the Colosseum, 50,000 plus of them, if it was full, wasn't just a random mix of those who happened to get tickets. It was a microcosm of the Roman political structure itself. Attendance, we think, in Rome was probably free, but you couldn't sit anywhere and you couldn't buy yourself the best seat. People sat in segregated groups according to their formal political status. Senators were in the front row in rather wide kind of business class seats with more space. The next rank of Roman society, the knights, were immediately behind. Then the rest of the free male population. This reconstruction here, with a load of women, and we think it looks like it's a modern reconstruction, slaves, is probably trying to imagine what's happening at the very, I think it is, the very, very highest levels at the back. For women and the enslaved went right in the gods at the back. Apart from the venerable Vestal virgins who got a ringside seat and the emperor's female relatives. He, the emperor, sat with them in the imperial box, no longer survives, but Jerome has a good go at it, facing his people, all ranked and all in their formal outfits. So under the empire, at least, what the gladiatorial games amounted to was a dramatic, staged encounter between the ruler and his ordered, ranked subjects. It was a chance to image in microcosm what the Roman political order was and looked like. So it's often argued what we should be seeing here is political theatre as much as bodily cruelty. And that's one of the reasons why they're all made to wear their togas in order to go. True. Perhaps even more commonly, though, after due expressions of horror, the historian's tendency has been to translate the games into some more comprehensible modern equivalent. In talking about gladiators in particular, rather than animal hunts, it's very hard to avoid the language of modern spectator sports. As I didn't avoid it just now when I both smuggled in wrestling and boxing and also the football leagues, right? It's partly irresistible because it appears to offer us some kind of terminology when we haven't got any other terminology to hand, and partly because some gladiators, despite their low status, do seem to have gained a degree of celebrity and a reputation as sort of erotic idols or pin-ups that look a bit like modern celebrities, sportsmen, movie stars, or whatever. One Roman satirist, for example, pilloried upper-class Roman ladies who left their husbands to run off with gladiators, you know, the rough trade. And something like this is what is going on almost in this 19th century painting. I think this looks as if it's been a private gladiator show at a Roman rich house. And some poor bloke is just about to be carried out on the floor. The victorious gladiator is standing up all tall, being simpered over by the house's ladies, right? And I think that Nettie is picking up something of that sense, that, that these are hot stuff for the Roman elite lady. That case is easily, let me say, overstated. It always used to be said, for example, that the remains of a heavily jewelled lady found in the gladiator barracks at Pompeii were evidence of her final tryst before the ashes fell with her gladiator lover. That looked quite plausible, but what the people who wanted to play that story didn't tell you was that there were 18 other victims found in the same room as the lady and the gladiator. So either it was more than just a one-to-one, as the ashes came down, or something else was going on. And much more likely is that this bejeweled lady had been trying to escape from town when the going got too bad and rushed into the gladiator barracks with a load of other people. But leaving that on one side, though, there was clearly some kind of celebrity come erotic charge to gladiator performance, which may help explain why emperors didn't always sit in their imperial box, but notoriously, like Commodus and others, leapt into the arena and acted as gladiators themselves. It was about who was going to be the real star of the show. And the emperor, looks like from stories, the emperor was always in danger of being upstaged, so would want to get down there to be the star himself. Now, all those arguments seem to me fine up to a point. Indeed, I've made all of them, so I don't think they're stupid. But what they do is evade the issue. They simply don't face the big question that we all shy away from, which is, how could the Romans do this? You don't actually get round that problem by saying it wasn't as deadly as we painted, because some of it was deadly. You can decrease the number of casualties, but you don't. It's, this is not a kind of nice sport, right? Or to go back to my ordinary bloke watching the shows, whatever you think about the sort of sub-Clifford Geertzian idea of political theatre in the amphitheatre, we don't really think that my bloke spent the time in the amphitheatre reflecting on his own position in the Roman social order, however important that image was. Right? So what are our options? If those are all yes, but what are our options? One logical position is to claim that the Romans, or many Romans, were simply crueler than we are, and so they enjoyed watching this kind of thing. Or rather, because no historical society I know of actually prides itself in its own cruelty, and plenty of Romans decried vehemently Civitia, as they called it. Perhaps their definition of cruelty was just very different from ours. And they were probably, anyway, much more used to seeing wounds, death, and dead bodies. Now, there may be something in this, something, but again, not everything. And interestingly, one writer in the late 2nd century CE makes an inadvertently, I think, relevant observation here. He's criticizing the spectators at the games. He said he was shocked and surprised that people who recoiled in horror at the sight of a corpse that had died a natural death were happy to look at men getting torn apart in the amphitheatre, which tends to go against the idea that all Romans were just laid back about corpses. And if we return to ancient representations of gladiators, most, like these awful cupids, really cutesy and naff, are as sanitized or more sanitized than our own representations of gladiators. They aren't a celebration of blood and guts. I think, then, we have to approach this quite differently, and I'm going to give you 2 ways to do that before I finish. I think we can't massage the troubling bits away. But I think that what you can do is ask much more fundamentally, how was what happened on the arena floor, how was that defined? What was going on? Now, I'm flying a bit of a kite here, but I've got 2 particular questions, both of which in some way overlap with our own cultural debates. I want to ask, how far did Roman spectators see the people fighting in the arena as human? And how far did they think what was happening was real? And we're going to have Commodus as a background to my answers to those questions. To begin to open this up, I want to go back to ancient criticisms of gladiatorial shows, and there were many more criticisms than you might think, but mostly not raising the issues you'd expect. Almost none, even including some Christian criticism, are concerned with what we would call humanitarian aspects. They're not concerned with the cruelty to the fighters or the cruelty to the animals. They focus entirely on the audience. So Roman critiques of gladiatorial display focuses on the audience. Some of those critiques are predictably snobbish critiques of popular culture. You know, the kind of posh guy who says, the ordinary people don't have the same sophisticated approach to this kind of spectacle that I do. Right? But many others are concerned with the effect of the shows on those who watch them. Irrational passions are aroused, reason is clouded. This is what the Roman billionaire philosopher Seneca had to say. Nothing is so damaging to good character than the habit of wasting time at the games, for then it is that vice steals secretly upon you through the avenue of pleasure. I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more excessive, more cruel, and more inhuman because I have been among human beings. Now, that's puzzling, I think, when you hear it first. But for me, the key is that Seneca stresses the humanity of the audience, with the implied contrast, I'm going to suggest, of the non-humanity of what they're watching. Now, that might seem to be pushing it, but it chimes interestingly with some other comments made in the 1st century BC, before the rule of the emperors, about a set of games in which there was little enjoyment, and in which the spectators, for once, did show compassion for a poor group of slaughtered elephants. Why? Asks the writer. Because there was a feeling that they were almost human. Now, the contrast here, I think, is not between a human and an animal victim. The point is that those elephants somehow broke through the assumption that everything on the wrong side of the arena barrier was inhuman. Right? It's the boundary between humanity and non-humanity. Now, we know that that is a contested boundary that in many ways we also debate. No society in history has not debated who it is who's going to count as fully human and who isn't, often in the process of justifying exploitation. John C. Calhoun, for example, questioned the humanity of Alexander Crummell when, as I mentioned yesterday, he questioned Cromwell's ability to learn Greek. But for my ordinary Roman bloke, I reckon that the watchability of the games, the fact that he could do it, in part depended on the shared illusion that the human spectators were watching a glorious, edge-of-your-seat spectacle, but they were not watching the murder of their fellow human beings. It also depended, I suspect, on an assumption, some kind of assumption, that what was happening wasn't really real, but was a constructed spectacle with actors. You get a hint of that in the poems celebrating the opening of the Colosseum, in describing the whole series of mythic executions in the arena, of which the Prometheus charade was only one. The poet Martial celebrates particularly the artifice and the theatricality of the reconstruction of a mythic death. It is as if the boundary between our real world and fantasy is set at the edge of the performance space. Now that, I would say, is not unlike, in some ways, some of our own boundaries that make watching the impossible possible. Why do millions of people now watch footage of shootings or of executions on their screens? The answer is not that they, or certainly not all of them, are unusually bloodthirsty. It is that the screen of the smartphone or the laptop marks, like the arena edge, the boundary between unwatchable reality and watchable representation. So one tentative answer to how could they do it is that the social and cultural contract of the arena was that the performers were not human and the performance of the slaughter was not real. But I want to finish by returning to Cassius Dio and to Bianchi Bandinelli. We met Dio in Lecture 1 in the Colosseum over a few days in 192 CE, no doubt in many ways engaged in the same kind of experience of looking and watching as my ordinary bloke, watching the non-human in a world of non-reality. But Dio was different. He was a member of the political elite, sitting on the front row, eyeball to eyeball with the Emperor Commodus, trying not to laugh, as Commodus, whom he regarded as a murderous tyrant, swung an ostrich head at them. And Dio is also an academic and a historian, and he included in his longer history the diary notes he took of that occasion in 192. From that, it's clear that he didn't much want to be there, but he showed up anyway. He admired those who were brave enough to stay away, but he thought he ought to think about the consequences if he did. He enjoyed sneering a little at how ridiculous and disorganized the games all were. That's the point of telling us about the giggle. Dio was clearly anti-tyranny, but he was anti-tyranny in a theoretical sense. You will have seen from the language I've chosen to use that I'm suggesting here a parallel between Dio and Bianchi Bandinelli, the first time anybody has made that comparison. I'm a great fan of Bianchi Bandinelli, but as I was preparing this lecture, I was repeatedly struck by how similar his rhetorical responses to tyranny in the form of Hitler and Mussolini were to those of the senator on the front row of the Colosseum, at least in their written accounts. Bianchi Bandinelli was also slightly mocking, a bit self-justifying, while reluctantly going along with it all, cooperating with tyranny, if not collaborating. As he said, he was a theoretical anti-fascist. So I guess that I'm closing this lecture and the series with one final, perhaps bleaker thought, not really about the arena or gladiators at all. It's, I suppose, the idea that responses to tyranny and the practices of collaboration, of muddling along under vicious regimes, might also be some of the things that the ancient world helps us think about. It might be some of the things that we share with the ancients, and maybe have even in part inherited from them. My point is that academics like Dio, like Bianchi Bandinelli, like me, and I think like quite a lot of you, need to think where we stand in all this and how much of a theoretical and quiet life, not putting our heads above the parapets, we really deserve. Thank you.
That was terrific, not only hopeful, but perhaps a bit prophetic. We have time for some questions, and as we have done on previous nights, we'll start with a question from the audience, and there are actually questions from what I understand are hundreds of guests watching virtually in each of the 3 nights. There's a question in the back.
Yesterday, you had mentioned that a way forward for classic programs would be to include Africa and East Asia as a focus. I wondered if you could tell us about any sort of texts that are from those regions that maybe have been suppressed or are not so well known that would be included in those kind of syllabuses?
I don't think I suggested it as a way forward. I said that I was laid back about changing disciplinary boundaries, but I didn't see them. I didn't, and I said I thought you gained some things and you lost others from doing that change. I didn't think that was the right solution to the ideas of diversifying the classics. Now, it depends where you go. I mean, I think that just to give an obvious example, though I think becoming less clearly obvious, one of the boundaries that has shifted, not hugely, but shifted significantly since I was a student, is the boundary between the classical world and Egypt, right? And when I was an undergraduate, you didn't really look at the evidence from papyri. It was absolutely amazing. I mean, it was the biggest chunk of evidence that you have about Roman provincial administration comes from Egypt, but we didn't see it. We weren't directed to it, apart from in very, very small chunks. So I think wherever you go, you find hidden texts, because texts are hidden by virtue of nobody saying, go read that. And do we think it's interesting? I do, to read the Epic of Gilgamesh. If we're thinking about early epic, should we actually be thinking about other early epics from the Mediterranean and its peripheries? still making it sound like the Mediterranean heartland. I was trying not to do that, but you know what I mean. Let me off. Yes, I do think that that's a good idea, and I don't think that there are texts that are hidden. I think that there are texts that we choose not to use, and that when we teach our students, we don't put on the bibliography. We don't make the subject of lectures. Your lectures are different if you put a different load of texts on. And I don't think it's better, but I think that you can change perspectives. And I think changing perspectives is a good idea.
There's a question. The microphone, I should have said, the microphones are on either side, and so we'll wait till the microphone makes its way up to this side.
Not that one.
Can I get back to the shock? When I was teaching in a classics department, one of my colleagues went on a walking tour in Nepal and showed the department slides of sacrifices at a local temple. And one saw prominent members of the US classics fraternity shocked at the realization that this was what happened every weekday, as it were, in the Roman world. Had sacrifice a place in the story you're telling us?
Yes, and I think it's got a very interesting place in the story, partly for the reason that you say, but also why I've been interested in it, and you will rightly say that's just showing how unwilling you are to be shocked. I've always been very struck by the way that in official civic Roman sacrifice, the elite are always distanced from the blood. The one thing that the elite they don't get spattered with blood. It says the elite, Mr. Consul, whoever, did a sacrifice. That does not mean he took his knife out and put it into the bull's hide. There were clear hierarchies of who got dirty, and it is absolutely clear that it was enslaved attendants who did the killing, and the higher in Roman status you were, the further you were from the blood. So, and that's one of the reasons that some of the alternative cults, another misuse of word, cult, the alternative religions in the Roman world were so shocking, and particularly the supposed Taurobolium, because what was it actually to be blooded by sacrifice? What was it to stand under a bull and get showered in its blood? So I think my answer to you is yes, but I think there were Roman critics who were asking themselves just the kind of questions that you and your colleagues were, right? How shocking is this?
Someone online was curious about whether there were female gladiators, or were they all just men?
There's one or two representations and inscriptions which appear to record female gladiators. So there are. If the answer is, were there ever any female gladiators? The answer is yes. How many there were, it's not clear how far this is a subversion of the system. And that what they are is they are turning the system over, or somebody is turning the system over by having women. Women actually at the arena is quite interesting, because there was, apart from the Vestal Virgins and the Emperor's women, they have to be relegated right to the very back. So it's women and the enslaved. Well, in terms of elite women, that means saying no elite women. The wife of the consul doesn't fetch up and walk up to the top of the arena to sit down with her slaves. Mm-hmm. So the idea that there were many women even as watchers, I think there's a question mark.
Okay. And then since we took two in person and one online, I'll do one more, a quick one from online. Someone's asking if you think that there is something inherently Roman about gladiatorial combat or the gladiator role per se, and they use a parallel of, let's say, a fishmonger, right? So every society has them. Is there something inherently Roman about the gladiator?
There is something inherently Roman in which the figure of the gladiator marks Roman culture throughout. Is it a gladiator society? In a certain way, Rome is a gladiator society. And you see that because it's not just that there's a lot of it about, and some form of combat, that sort of combat in most towns, but you see it infiltrating into ways of thinking, philosophical argument, the idea of the gladiator as actually facing death bravely, the idea of the philosopher in the mold of the gladiator. So, I mean, I think when you kind of get when you get a sense of something which is more embedded in the culture than just being a frequent show on a Saturday afternoon, it's when you can see it as part of the metaphoric language, ways of thinking, the symbolism of the culture. And if you say that about the gladiators, that is just like in England, football. Where the metaphors of football, the offside rule and this kind of thing, is part of ways of talking about other things. It is baffling because we don't know how it started. The first attested gladiatorial show is at a funeral in 264, I think, BCE. And they're thought to be, Romans say, they connect them with funerary ritual. But at that point, they're fantasizing, I think, as much as we are about what the hell it's doing. And you don't find it elsewhere.
Great, I like that answer. There's a question up front.
So,
oh, okay, yeah.
Thank you. So do you think that current NFL players are really gladiators, and instead of death, they have brain damage for whole life? But in principle, it's the same. And by the way, there is no females playing NFL in contrast to gladiators.
Sure, well, I didn't quite catch it.
Yeah, so the comparison between the gladiator and the modern American football player with CTE, brain damage, and that there's not a parallel there for women playing football.
No. I mean, my problem is that I think, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, we instantly resort to the analogy of sport. Because it's actually very hard to find a language to talk about gladiators in. So we start to talk about winners and losers. He lost the fight, he's a celebrity, and we're very, very soon into a rather domesticated view of prize fighters, football stars, and whatever. Gladiators have a shorter life expectancy than most professional footballers in any football regime. One thing we do know is that some do survive and retire. But of course, and we have tombstones of those that survive and retire. The difficulty is that those who survive and retire are overrepresented in the tombstones, because those who get knocked out in their first fight and skewered in the Colosseum do not get a nice tombstone put up by loving wife and kids, right? So the physical and epigraphic inscriptional remains tend to privilege those who came out the other end. And so it makes it very hard to know what percentage of these people are actually getting killed.
We have one last question, and I don't know where the microphones are, but I saw a hand. Okay.
Was there a distinctly Christian critique of the games I mean, apart from the game's utility in generating martyrs, but was there a sort of a moral or theological sort of take on spectacles of cruelty, which again could have been complicated with the rule of crucifixion?
I will answer that as best I can. And for further information, I'm going to direct you to Professor Ando. What I think for me is very interesting is that you would imagine, the neat thing to think would be that the Christians come along and say, that is totally cruel and awful, and you've got to stop this. Now, that does not happen. And Christian writers, certainly, we were talking about the metaphorization of gladiatorial combat. Christian writers use that language, that's imbued with that language too. For me, what's always been more interesting, really, but it's a version of what you say, is that, in a sense, the martyrdom in the arena, for me, eventually has the effect of blowing the logic of the games to pieces. That if you say one of the logics of the gladiatorial arena, and I think it's only one, it doesn't explain it, is that it is imperial power seeing his people ranked in rank order, on display as a polity, on the seats, and in the center of the abominated other, right? Who's ultimately, at least in the logic, are going to not survive, right? And I think they're the abominated other, the subhuman abominated other would be my view. Now, what happens within martyrdom, I think, and the retelling of the stories of martyrdom, is that that logic gets overturned because the victors turn out to be on the floor of the arena. Now, once that has happened, there is a sense in which the logic of the gladiatorial shows, the political logic, has been spiked. That's what I say. But I'm sure there will be other people who have different views from me. You can't, as soon as St. Perpetua in Carthage is the heroine by virtue of being martyred, then the logic of the show doesn't work any longer.
Well, this has been just a wonderful 3-lecture series, and we should not only, two things, thank Professor Beard one last time for these 3 wonderful lectures. But please, before you go, also mark your calendars for next year's Berlin Lecture Series. Thanks to the Berlin family. Yi-Yoon Lee, the poet, will be the Berlin lecturer for next year. So thank you again. Thank you again, Professor Beard.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you for coming.
Good night, everyone.